The morning of May 4, 1932, unfolded like a painting brought to life. Sunshine spilled across the cobblestone streets of Vasastan, Stockholm. The narrow alleys bustled with the usual hum of bicycles and footsteps, while the smell of fresh bread wafted from the corner bakery. It was an ordinary day until it wasn't. By midday, a disquiet began to settle over the Atlas district. A strange, acrid smell floated through the corridors of a pale, three-story building on Råstrandsgatan. At first, the neighbors dismissed it as the scent of spoiled food or a clogged drain. But by early afternoon, the odor had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was alarming. The smell was strongest near apartment 3B, the home of Marta Lundin. A widow in her mid-40s, Marta had lived alone in the building for years, known by neighbors for her quiet but polite demeanor. She often spent her mornings knitting by the window or tending to her small collection of houseplants, but on this day, the window curtains remained drawn, and no one had seen her emerge. A neighbor, old Mr. Elias Grund, was the first to knock on her door. His knuckles rapped against the wood 3 times. Silence. He leaned closer, his ear brushing against the doorframe. The smell made him recoil, but he knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. By 1 p.m., a small crowd of tenants had gathered outside Marta's door. Whispers passed between them. Someone claimed they'd last seen Marta 2 days ago, carrying groceries upstairs. Another swore they'd heard strange noises coming from her apartment late last night, a scraping sound, followed by muffled voices. It was Mrs. Ingrid Nilsson, the landlord's wife, who finally made the decision. "Call the police," she said. Marta Lundin had always been a quiet presence in the Atlas district, a figure so unassuming she might as well have been invisible. Her small apartment on Råstrandsgatan reflected her life, modest, dimly lit, and filled with only the essentials. A rickety table stood by the single window, its surface perpetually cluttered with newspapers and knitting needles. Marta kept her curtains drawn most of the time, letting only the faintest light spill into her world. She wasn't unfriendly, just distant. Locals knew her as that woman from 3B, an aging, solitary figure who appeared every now and then to buy bread, milk, or candles. Her gait was slow, almost hesitant, and she avoided lingering in conversations, retreating into her apartment before anyone could pry. Even the shopkeepers who exchanged goods with her daily knew little about her beyond the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes. Years ago, Marta had been a waitress at a bustling cafe in Södermalm, where her days were filled with clinking cups and the chatter of customers. But life had a way of turning cold. She lost her job when the cafe closed, and with it, her connection to the world outside her 4 walls. The few who had known her during her waitressing days had long since moved on, and Marta had faded into obscurity. By the time she moved to the Atlas district, she had become a fixture of solitude. Her existence was like a whisper in the middle of the city's chaos, a quiet rhythm that passed unnoticed. To her neighbors, she was little more than a ghost, a shadow in a world of noise. Which was why the events of May 4, 1932, struck such a chord of fear. When the police arrived, the building's tenants gathered nervously on the staircase. A young constable, Lars Nystrom, and his older colleague, Inspector Gunnar Falk, stood at Marta's door. Lars removed his hat and knocked firmly. The sound echoed through the silent hall. No answer. Gunnar produced a crowbar, his expression grim. "Step back," he instructed the crowd. The door gave way with a loud creak, and the smell that poured out was so overwhelming that even Gunnar, a seasoned officer, flinched. The neighbors gasped, covering their noses and mouths. As the officers entered the apartment, the crowd pressed closer to the threshold, desperate for a glimpse inside. Marta's apartment was just as they'd imagined it, small and cluttered, the air heavy with the scent of damp and mildew. But it wasn't the clutter or the faint traces of her ordinary life that drew their attention. It was Marta herself. She lay on the floor of her parlor, motionless. Her body was twisted unnaturally, her pale hand clutching at the rug as though she had tried to drag herself to safety. The dark circles under her eyes gave the impression of a restless spirit, her expression frozen in what could only be described as terror. But it was what surrounded her that made the scene even more chilling. Scrawled on the walls in thick, black ink, or perhaps something darker, were strange symbols. Jagged, looping shapes that no one recognized, their angles sharp and unsettling. A broken oil lamp lay near her feet, its glass shards glinting in the dim light. Inspector Gunnar Falk surveyed the room, his jaw tightening. No sign of forced entry, he muttered. But this wasn't natural. When the police finally breached the door to Marta Lundin's apartment, the stale air rushed out like the breath of something long buried. The neighbors, who had crowded anxiously behind them, froze in place as the scene inside unfolded before their eyes. Marta lay on her back in the middle of the parlor, her body unnaturally still. Her once pale face was now ghostly white, her expression fixed in a mix of terror and pain. Deep wounds marred the back of her skull, as though she had been struck with brutal force. But it was her neck that told the most horrifying story. Her jugular vein had been sliced open with a precision that made the officers shudder. The skin around the wound was clean, as though the blood had not simply spilled out but had been purposefully drawn. Marta's lifeless body lay drained, devoid of even a trace of the vital liquid that had once kept her alive. Inspector Gunnar Falk stood over the body, his seasoned face twisted in disbelief. Lars Nystrom, younger and far less prepared for the gruesome sight, took a step back, clutching the doorframe for support. Her blood, it's gone, Gunnar murmured, kneeling closer to examine the wound. But it was the corner of the room that caught Lars's attention. There, beneath the dim glow of the single unbroken lamp, sat a small ceramic cup. Dark red stains ringed the inside of the vessel, the unmistakable hue of dried blood. Lars pointed it out, his voice trembling. "Inspector, look." Gunnar approached the cup cautiously, his boots crunching against shards of glass from the broken oil lamp scattered across the floor. He crouched to pick it up, turning it over in his gloved hands. The bloodstains were vivid, fresh enough to suggest that someone had used the cup to drink from it. The realization was almost too much to comprehend. "Whoever did this," Gunnar said slowly, his voice low, "they didn't just kill her. They drained her. And they drank." The room was eerily quiet, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Its steady rhythm felt like a cruel joke in the face of such madness. Lars swallowed hard, scanning the room for any sign of how the killer might have entered or left. "But the doors were locked, sir. And the windows, there's no sign of forced entry. Nothing's broken, nothing's been tampered with. How could anyone have gotten in?" The inspector straightened, glancing at the unbroken panes of glass, the undisturbed locks on the door. "That's the question, isn't it?" The neighbors, despite their terror, began whispering among themselves. Some swore that Marta had been cursed, that her reclusive life had invited something unnatural into her home. Others claimed they'd heard stories of strange rituals and dark figures haunting the Atlas district in the dead of night. One thing, however, was certain: no one had seen or heard anything. No footsteps, no screams, no sounds of struggle. It was as though the murder had taken place in complete silence, invisible to the world outside. Gunnar turned back to Marta's body, his gaze lingering on her lifeless hand, which still clutched at the edge of the rug. It was as if she had tried to crawl, to escape. But from what? Or who? And then there were the symbols. Though initially overlooked in the shock of the scene, they were unmistakable now. Scrawled across the walls in dark, jagged lines were the same strange shapes the neighbors had glimpsed earlier. Symbols that seemed neither Swedish nor from any recognizable alphabet. Some resembled runes, but their angles were far sharper, their edges far more sinister. One of the symbols, drawn just above Marta's body, looked almost like an eye with a sharp, angular pupil. Gunnar frowned, gesturing toward the markings. "Get a photographer in here. I want these documented. Every last one of them." Lars hesitated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you think this could be? I don't know, some kind of ritual, sir? Something occult?" Gunnar didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the blooded cup, then on Marta's drained body. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own in the flickering light. He finally spoke, his voice heavy with unease. "I don't know what this is, Nystrom. But whatever it is, it's no ordinary crime." Marta Lundin's life had always been a question mark, her past a blank page that even those closest to her could not fill. She had arrived in Stockholm years before, slipping into the quiet anonymity of the Atlas district as though she were running from something or someone. Locals whispered that she had fled a troubled past, that her cautious demeanor and reclusive habits were born of fear. She was always looking over her shoulder, Mrs. Nilsson, the landlord's wife, would later say. Like she thought something or someone was following her. Others chalked it up to madness, the product of a fragile mind unraveling in isolation. But after her gruesome death, those murmurs took a darker turn. People began to wonder if Marta's fears had been well-founded, if her death was the culmination of a horror she had long tried to escape. Despite the efforts of the Stockholm police, the investigation stalled almost as quickly as it had begun. With no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, and no obvious suspects, the case was a labyrinth with no exits. Fingerprints were smudged and incomplete. The blood samples taken from the apartment were inconclusive, and the rudimentary forensic tools of the 1930s offered little hope of answers. Inspector Gunnar Falk pursued every lead he could find, chasing rumors of occult groups and secret societies rumored to operate in the shadows of the city. He even entertained the wilder theories, whispers of a madman who believed himself to be a vampire, stalking lonely women under the cover of darkness. But each trail ended in dead ends and silence. By the winter of 1932, the case was officially declared unsolved. The Stockholm press, eager to sell papers, dubbed the unknown killer the Atlas Vampire. The name stuck, feeding the imaginations of a frightened city. Over time, theories about Marta's murder became a tapestry of fear and speculation. Some believed her death was the work of a deranged serial killer, a predator who drank blood as part of some twisted ritual. Others saw the hand of the supernatural, insisting that Marta had been the victim of a genuine vampire, an immortal being who had passed unnoticed through the bustling streets of Stockholm. Still, there were those who focused on Marta herself. What had she been running from? Why had she spent her life looking over her shoulder? Had she known her killer, invited them into her home willingly, only to meet her end at their hands? The strange symbols scrawled on her walls only deepened the mystery. Scholars of folklore and ancient languages debated their meaning for decades. Some claimed they were runes of protection, placed there by Marta herself to ward off evil. Others saw them as a calling card, left behind by the killer as a signature of their dark intent. Whatever the truth, it remained out of reach. Though the years have long since buried Marta Lundin's story in the pages of forgotten history, her name still lingers in Stockholm's dark corners. The apartment building on Råstrandsgatan has changed hands many times, and new tenants often report strange occurrences, faint whispers in the night, unexplained cold drafts, and a persistent scent of lavender, like the one Marta used to wear. And always, there is the story of the cup. A blood-stained vessel found beside her drained body, a grotesque relic that has become the symbol of the unsolved mystery. Who or what was the Atlas Vampire? Was it the work of a deranged human, a supernatural force, or something in between? The questions remain unanswered, but the fear it inspired has never truly left. Marta Lundin's life may have been quiet and unremarkable, but her death left an indelible mark on Stockholm's history, a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Even today, when the night grows cold and the streets grow quiet, locals passing by Råstrandsgatan sometimes glance over their shoulders. After all, the Atlas Vampire was never caught.